What's going on, Pathway Church? I hope you're doing good. Welcome back to tonight's Bible study. We're in our series, The Original Game of Thrones, where we're going through the book of 1 Samuel. And tonight, the title of the lesson is, well, I'm just going to say it. It's The Naked King. If you've been with us the last few lessons, one of the things we have seen is we have seen the rise of David's popularity in Israel. He's killed Goliath. He's become a major player in Saul's army. And Saul has grown very jealous of David. So much in fact that he has tried to have David killed. He tried to have him killed by sending him on some difficult missions. He's personally tried to do it by throwing a spear and pinning David to the wall. And now he is trying to enlist some of his men to kill David, including his son Jonathan. So let me read through a few verses in chapter 19 to kind of give you a feel where we're at here. Chapter 19, 1 Samuel, verse 1. Now Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. So Jonathan's going to kind of step in and intervene and try to talk some sense into his father. Look at verse 4. Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good towards you. So Jonathan's able to kind of talk Saul out of this and talk some sense into him. However, this does not satiate Saul's desire and passion to kill David and be rid of him. You go back and you see in verse 8, and there was war again, and David went out and fought the Philistines, and he struck them with a mighty blow, and they fled from him. Now a distressing spirit came from the Lord upon Saul, and he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing his instrument. So David is there, continuing to serve Saul, and it says, So Saul sought to pin David to the wall with a spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence, and he drove the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Look at verse 11, and I want to read verses 11 through 13. Now, here is when Saul sends some messengers, and I'll put messengers in quotes. They're more like assassins to go and kill David in his home. And remember, David is married to Saul's younger daughter, Michal or Michal. All right, it says in verse 11, So Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, If you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So she warns him. And it says, So she let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Verse 13. And so she took an image and laid it in the bed and put a cover of goat's hair on its head and covered it with clothes. So she hides, and then Saul's messengers come, and they ask, Hey, where's David at? And she said, He's sick. Of course, they come in, and they find that David has fled. Saul confronts his daughter about this. And again, he feels jealous, he feels betrayed, he feels wronged. Now, David, in verse 18, says, So David fled and escaped, and he went to Samuel at Ramah. So David goes to, I think, probably the only safe place he can find in Israel. He goes to Ramah, where the prophet Samuel lives. And there he has a school of prophets. And what will eventually happen is that Saul will send messengers, and I'll put messengers in quotes, and soldiers to find David. They come and they end up getting caught up in the spirit among the prophets, prophesying to one another, probably just worshiping, praising, maybe coming to the realization that what they're doing is wrong. More messengers, soldiers are sent, and of course they get caught up. Finally, Saul himself will go, and we'll see what happens to him towards the end of the lesson tonight. Now we look and we find that Saul is a troubled man. He is troubled. His heart has been hardened as a result of his stubbornness and his refusal to confess his wrongs, admit his sins, and repent. He will not truly repent. I think this is a man who feels completely justified in everything he has done over the past several years. He is a man who has repented on the surface in order to save face, but not someone who has truly repented in his heart. I think he is a man who feels everything he's done is right, and he feels betrayed by Samuel. He feels God has unfairly taken the kingdom from him, and it's made him that much more bitter. He becomes consumed by his jealousy and his desire to exonerate himself. In other words, to prove himself, or prove to himself, to prove to others, I really have nothing to repent of. Now, we look at David, we look at Saul, and we see that these are men of polar opposites. And if you were with us last week's lesson, we talked about this little Hebrew word, sakal, which just shows how that David behaved wisely. He was a man who, a couple of things, knew how to keep his mouth shut, and a man who remained teachable. Let's just look at Saul in this chapter, a man who remains stubborn, a man who is determined to do things his way, a man who refuses to repent. Let's look and see how he is different. We see in this chapter that Saul regularly explodes in anger. I am sure he says and does rash things. He accuses his son, he accuses his daughter of betraying him, siding with David, even though they're in the right. On the other hand, David we see as a man who knows how to keep his mouth shut. We also see that Saul is too proud to admit when he has sinned, when he is wrong, and repent. He will not truly repent. David, on the other hand, is a man who is known for his humility and his repentant attitude. In fact, later on, even when he is the king, when he is confronted by the prophet Nathan, David does not justify, does not excuse his sin with Bathsheba, but immediately repents in sackcloth and ashes for days as a result of being confronted with his sin. We also see that Saul could not be convinced otherwise of David's innocence and David's fidelity. No matter if it was his son, no matter if it was David himself who continued to serve Saul, who continued to be a champion in Saul's army, he could not be convinced that David was an innocent man and that David was a man who was completely committed to Saul. David, on the other hand, would remain teachable the remainder of his life. He would be able to be corrected. It doesn't mean David was perfect, but he was a teachable and a person who was allowed himself to be corrected, even by those who were subordinate to him. In addition, he was very devoted to Saul as well, and we'll see that as David's story progresses and he eventually has to leave and wander or run around in the wilderness for several years. A few lessons learned from this chapter as we see Saul continually harassing and pursuing David in his jealousy and anger. First, you don't always have to prove yourself or lash out when you feel like you've been done wrong. This is one of the things we see in Saul's character over and over again. Always this desire, always this attempt to justify himself, to prove himself, to lash out when things don't go his way. This is us saying stuff when we're hurt, when we're angry, stuff that we can't take back, stuff that creates tension, stuff that we're going to later regret. This is us posting something on Facebook when we've been done wrong and maybe we shouldn't have done that, and now it's out there for everybody to see, right? And so we don't always have to prove ourselves. We don't always have to make our point, and we don't always have to justify ourselves. Here's the other thing. In fact, the Bible actually warns that God is the one who will justify us. God is the one who will stand, and he will be the one who fights our battles. Number two, pay attention when people around you, especially those who care for you, are saying one thing, but maybe you feel another. Okay? This is something very difficult, I think, especially in our culture, for us to get outside of our own feelings, because whatever you feel, that's your truth nowadays, right? But we need to start paying attention to those objective voices, especially people around us who care for us. And we may feel one way, but those voices around us are speaking something different. We need to pay attention to them and not easily dismiss them. This is maybe when you're in love and maybe there are family members who are concerned about that relationship. Or maybe you want to quit your job and there are some family members who kind of question whether or not you should do this at this moment. Or maybe you're withdrawn and you're not interacting with your friends and they reach out and you refuse to respond and you just want to kind of be by yourself. Listen, pay attention to those people. Maybe it's something on the positive. Maybe you're not sure that you want to take the next step in advancing, or the next step in advancing your career, or maybe you're not sure if you want to take the next step in walking in and figuring out what God's call is on your life. And you got family members around you that say, "Hey, you can do that. We'll be here for you." You need to listen to those voices, whether they're trying to bring correction or whether they're trying to bring encouragement. Don't just go by what you feel. Here's the other thing I would suggest. When you keep ignoring God's voice and the advice of others, when you keep on being stubborn-headed, trying to prove your point, trying to justify yourself, trying to justify your actions, trying to get what you want, you'll end up looking like a fool. All right? You keep ignoring the voice of God. You keep dismissing the voice of those who care for you, and you're going to wind up looking like a fool. Look at what happens to Saul here. So he went down to Ramah in verse 23, and the Spirit of the Lord was upon him also. You remember all the messengers and the soldiers he sent, how the Spirit of the Lord would come upon them, they begin to prophesy. Same thing happens to Saul. He goes down to find David. He is intent on killing him. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him also, and he went on and he prophesied until he came to Neoth in Ramah. And he also stripped off his clothes and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all day and all night. Therefore, they say, Saul is also among the prophets. So here is Saul going down to kill David. He ends up, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. He ends up laying in the ground naked for one night and one day. I'm telling you, you keep ignoring the voice of God, keep ignoring those around you who care for you, and you will end up looking like a fool. Don't be stubborn. Remain teachable. Don't try to always prove a point. I'm telling you, sometimes we'll say stuff that is stupid, stuff that is hurtful, stuff that will destroy relationships because we're acting out and lashing out in anger and frustration or out of offense. We'll post something on Facebook that makes us look dumb or uninformed. And then, and we'll keep doing that. And then everybody will say, well, that's just how they are. They always got some complaint to make. They always got to say something negative about somebody, right? Or maybe we'll burn the wrong bridges and people will no longer trust us. Or maybe we get fired because of something we said or did when we lashed out in stubbornness or anger. Or maybe we make family gatherings awkward. I'm telling you, learn how sometimes to just keep your mouth shut. Learn how to take the advice of other people despite how you may feel at the moment. And make sure that you look to the future and you don't keep ignoring God's voice only to later on look like a fool because you refuse to hear what God had to say and refuse to heed the advice of those who care for you. God bless y'all. I hope this has helped. We'll see you soon.